Hello friends, the poem for today's discussion is Digging by Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney is one of the major poets of the 20th century. He was born in 1939 and he died in 2013. He is a native of Northern Ireland and he was raised in County Derry and later lived for many years in Dublin. He is the author of over 20 volumes of poetry and criticism, and he edited several widely used anthologies. Death of a Naturalist, Door into the Dark, Electric Light are a few of his anthologies. He wrote essays too on poetry and on poets like William Wordsworth, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and Elizabeth Bishop. He is also a translator, and he has translated selections from Sophocles, Ovid's Metamorphoses, and the Old English epic Beowulf. Heaney taught at the Harvard University from 1985 to 2006, and he also served as the Oxford Professor of Poetry from 1989 to 1994. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995 for, this is the citation that the Nobel Committee gave him, for works of lyrical beauty and ethical depth which exalt everyday miracles and the living past. And Blake Morrison, in his work Seamus Heaney, he has written that the author here, the reference is to Seamus Heaney, that rare thing, a poet rated highly by critics and academics, yet popular with the common reader. That is an achievement, definitely. To be highly rated by the critics and to be enjoyed by a common reader is surely an accomplishment for a poet. Part of Heaney's popularity stems from his subject matter. He writes mostly about modern Northern Ireland, its farms, its cities, and the cultural strife there, the civil strife, the farms, the cities, and the civil strife, the natural culture of Ireland, the language which has been overrun by the English rule, and the New York Review of Books essayist Richard Murphy describes Heaney as the poet who has shown the finest art in presenting a coherent vision of Ireland, past and present. And Heaney's work, when you look at them, when you read most of his poems, they are most concerned with the past, even his earliest poems of the 1960s. So even though his family left the farm where he was brought up, it was called Mossbourne, in 53, and even though his life since has been a series of moves from one place to another, farther and farther away from his birthplace, the departures were more geographical than psychological. He kept himself very close to his native place. The rural County Derry is the country of the mind, where much of Heaney's poetry is still grounded. And all the subsequent shifts and the developments, they all depended upon the original journey from Mossbourne, which the poet has described as a removal from the earth of farm labor to the heaven of education. So he moved away to get education, but this is where he really belonged. It is not surprising then that this move turned out to be a recurrent theme in his work. When he was once asked, when Heaney was once asked about the value of poetry in the times of crisis, Heaney answered, "It is precisely at such moments that people realize they need more to live than economics." And in his own words, "If poetry and the arts do anything," he said, "they can fortify your inner life, your inwardness." So he always found strength in poetry. He always felt that poetry replenished his soul whenever he was at a loss. Now, coming to this particular poem, which is widely anthologized, the poem titled Digging, this is the opening poem of his first poetry collection in 1966, which is titled Death of a Naturalist. It is a free verse poem. There are 8 stanzas and 31 lines in all. Some stanzas are short and some are long, stanzas of varying length. There is no set rhyme scheme. It begins in the present, and then it slowly moves to the past, and then it returns to the present. That is how the poem is designed. Now let me read the poem to you. Maybe I'll just read the whole thing in one go. Digging by Seamus Heaney. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Tono's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I have no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. That is how the poem goes, and that is how it ends. He starts the poem with between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. Same way he ends the poem with the same, very similar lines. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. So that is the poem. Now let's take a look at it line by line. So as mentioned earlier, the poem begins in the present. Okay, so here we have the writer, the poet, maybe Heaney himself, sitting there with a pen in his hand. And of course, there would be a paper in front of him, and he sits there waiting for a poem to arrive. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. The short, thick pen, he holds it in his fingers, and he says, snug as a gun. It fits his fingers just like a gun would fit the finger of the fingers of a soldier. So this is the weapon. So there, that is the significance of the pen. The pen is the weapon of the writer, just as the gun is the weapon of a soldier. So he makes it very clear right in the beginning of the poem that he is a writer by profession, and the pen is the tool or the weapon which he wields. And this again, these two lines about him sitting with a pen waiting for an idea to arrive, it reminds one of the poem The Thought Fox, written by Ted Hughes, where Hughes also talks about the writer at night sitting there with a pen and a paper, waiting for something, for inspiration or for a poem to come down from his head into the paper. So always when I read this, I am reminded of Ted Hughes' The Thought Fox. So here, as he sits there with this pen ready to write, he hears a sound. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging. So as he sits, it's generally quiet, and now he starts hearing and he starts listening to a certain sound. and that is a clean rasping sound. So he is in the upstairs room, and under my window down there in the yard, he can hear the sound coming from there. The sound, the rasping sound, when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. This is not soft mud, but it is gravelly ground. And here again he must be speaking about Ireland, and Ireland, as you may know, is a place which is generally kind of rocky, and it is not the soft kind of silt that you would find in Ireland, but it's a rough ground, and it is not conducive to the cultivation of all crops. Mainly it is potato that is grown there in large scale. And so all the writers from Ireland, when you read the works written by Irish authors, you can always see that they talk about Ireland and the topography and the culture and the cultivation, especially the potato farming. So here again he talks about the sound of the spade sinking into the gravelly ground, so that rasping sound can be heard, and he knows even without looking that it is his father who is digging there. And then he goes to the window, he looks down at his father working down in the field. I look down till it's, now you can see here this sentence, it just continues on to the next line. You don't have a full stop at the end of I look down, but the sentence continues, and this is what you would call enjambment, where a sentence just continues on to the next stanza. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low. So from where he stands, what he can see is the back of his father. So his father is bending over among the flower beds. He bends low. Rump is the behind, the back of the father. Straining rump, because he's straining over to do something there. Till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away. And so when the father bends down and when he comes up, the poet is reminded of his father when he was young, the younger version. That's why he says, till his straining rump among the flower bed bends low, comes up 20 years away. So that is why I said at the beginning that this poem begins in the present but slowly moves towards the past. So he sees the father at present, the old man that he is now, and then suddenly when he rises up from his bent position, what he sees is the younger version of his father, some 20 years younger, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. So those days, now here it is flower beds. Maybe now the father is not exactly cultivating potatoes, but you know how our grandparents and our parents who have been working in the fields, working with the soil, even when they are old, they cannot really stop themselves from working. So you would find them always tinkering around, working in the garden, planting this, planting that, removing weeds. So here too, maybe the father, that is what he is doing now. He doesn't really have to work hard like he used to when he was young among the flower beds. But now when he rises up, the author, the poet, sees him as that young man, 20 years younger, who was working in the potato fields. Now potato drills refers to shallow furrows in which seeds are sown. You have furrows in the fields. You must have seen furrows where you have mud raised in a line, and then you have a shallow path, and then again you have mud raised in a long row. So that is the potato drills where the seeds are sown. So he sees his father. It's a sudden kind of a flashback. He sees his father working in the shallow potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug. The shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. So those days when his father worked, he used to wear a coarse boot, the kind of boots that farmers wear, because they are always working in the mud, in the wet, moist soil. And so he sees how his father stands there with the shaft against the inside knee. The shaft is the long handle of this spade, and the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. So he used to, it is placed there firmly. He rooted out tall tops, so he's digging, and now the shaft is levered, or it is placed firmly against his inside knee. He bends down, he takes out all the tall tops, means I guess he's picking potatoes from the ground. He's digging or uncovering the potatoes from the earth. He pulls out all the tall tops, or maybe the leafy tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked. So these are all movements, and again, these are all movements of this farmer. He bends down, he keeps the shaft there, the whole spade there, rooted or placed firmly in the ground. He takes the potatoes, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes, and the bright edge is the edge of the shiny edge of the spade. He slowly scatters new potatoes, because he doesn't want to cut the potatoes or damage the potatoes. So very carefully he scatters new potatoes that we picked. So this potato farming, or especially the potato harvesting, used to be a family affair, where the whole family would be out in the field, and the men would dig, and slowly they would unravel the potatoes from the earth, and the children and the women, they would be coming behind them with baskets or sacks. They would pick the potatoes and put it into the baskets. So that is how it used to be, and he remembers all that, to scatter new potatoes that we picked. We might refer to the children. The poet and his brothers are loving the cool hardness in our hands, and when they touched those potatoes which were freshly taken from the mud, the soil, it used to be very cool, and he can still feel the cool hardness in his hands, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God. So with great admiration, now as he looks at this father, he says, by God, the old man could handle a spade. Means he was very good with the spade. He was a very good farmer. He was an expert in handling the spade and in taking out potatoes without damaging them. The old man could handle a spade just like his old man. And now thinking of his father reminds him of his grandfather, like his old man. Means his father's old man, in the sense, the grandfather. So the way he says, by God, the old man could handle a spade, you can see the reverence that the poet has for the manual labor of his father and his grandfather. And he takes great pride in the efficiency of his people as farmers. He doesn't feel bad that his ancestors were farmers. Instead, he boasts about their the dexterity that they had, their efficiency as farmers. And so he goes on to tell us about his grandfather. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Okay, so he says he cut more turf. Now turf, it refers to spongy soil. A spongy soil, and this was formed by decomposed plant materials. Especially in wetlands and in marshy places, they had this decomposed plant materials, and that was supposed to be very rich kind of soil. And in Ireland, they used to cut these big pieces of this turf, and they used to dry it so that it can be used as fuel, because it was actually, you had grass and all leaves, all that dried. That is what made the turf. And so when they dried it, they could, just like in India we have this practice of drying dung, cow dung. It is made into kind of round plates. It is flattened out and it is dried and it is used as fuel, isn't it? Same way here too, they used to cut the spongy soil or the turf, and they used to dry it and use it as fuel. And a person needed expertise to cut the turf, and he says, my grandfather was an expert in that. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man in Tonersborg. It was a place near where they lived. You remember I mentioned the place called County Derry. That is where he spent his childhood. So he says, nobody else could cut so much turf like my grandfather could. So my grandfather was a kind of a hero, or among the farmers at least. And then he tells us how once I carried him milk in a bottle corked sloppily with paper. So when he was a boy, sometimes he used to be given the duty of taking milk or refreshments for his grandfather who was working in the bog. And so once he remembers taking a bottle of milk that was corked sloppily with paper, means the bottle did not really have a cork or a lid. So just some crumpled paper was put there so that the milk would not spill out. And what did the grandfather do when he got that milk? He straightened up, because he was working there. He straightened up to drink it, and then immediately he started working. He did not bother to take rest. He did not bother to chat with the boy. He drank the milk in one swig. He returned the bottle. He fell to right away. Fell to right away means he immediately started working. Means he did not need rest. Shows that he was such a strong man. Then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly. Cutting, okay, and slicing neatly. So they usually cut this turf in big slices, and they take it and keep it that side, and then they carry it home, heaving sods over his shoulder. So he used to cut them and throw them over his shoulder to the place where he was gathering them. Going down and down for the good turf, digging. So once again, he talks about this activity of digging, the manual labor that his ancestors did with such dexterity and with such love for what they were doing. So you feel that when you read it, you feel that this very mundane activity of digging, what is so special about somebody working in the field? But for those who really like it, it's a wonderful thing. And so the poet makes us feel as if this is something very artistic. That's why he says nicking, slicing, as though he's designing something out of what he's doing, with so much of dedication to what he's doing, not bothering to take rest, not lazing around, but completely involved in what he's doing. So the act of digging seems to appear as an artistic activity. And he talks about this digging, and then he says the cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat. So he can very vividly recall the sensations, the cold, the smells, the sounds. You remember earlier he told us about the cool hardness. So all the senses are kind of worked very well in this poem, or the senses are evoked very well in this poem. So he told us about the cool hardness of the potatoes freshly taken from the earth, and here he talks about the cold smell of potato mold, the potato taken from the moist earth, the smell of the potato, and the squelch and slap. The squelch, when you stamp on wet mud, that the squelchy noise. And so he says, he talks about the squelch and slap of soggy peat, because we know that the turf is moist. So when he cuts down this peat again is, as I told you, this turf is what is called peat, and dried peat is used as fuel. So when his grandfather cuts it there and he stamps it, there is this sound, the squelch and slap. And when he throws it, when it falls down on the ground, all these noises, squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. So again, the cutting, the way he cuts. You remember he mentioned about nicking and slicing neatly. So short, curt cuts of an edge edge, maybe the edge of the spade, through living roots awaken in my head. So now again, living roots might also be the roots that connect him to his ancestors. When he starts talking about how they used to work in the fields and how they used to work on the turf, he is reminded of the culture, the Irish culture of farming and cultivation and agriculture and the potatoes, all that comes alive. So maybe through living roots awaken in my head also refers to that connection. But he says, but I have no spade to follow men like them. He says, unfortunately though, I am not a farmer. Though my father was a farmer, his grandfather was a farmer, his father before him was definitely a farmer, but unfortunately I am not one. But I have no spade to follow men like them. But though he is a bit disappointed or saddened by the fact that he did not take up farming, he still tries to console himself, saying, between my finger and my thumb the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. You see that? So the pen becomes a metaphor. The pen becomes a spade itself. Earlier his father used the spade to dig. Now he says, I'll dig with it. So you can see that the pen becomes the spade, and this is an ideal example of a metaphor. And so here you can see that the poet shows great admiration for work, whether it is the work that he is doing as a poet, or whether it is the work of his ancestors. The great admiration that he feels is very, very evident in the poem, and the reverence that he has always felt for the work of his father and grandfather. And so the manual labor of the farmers, it is likened, or he feels that is very similar to the creative labor of a poet. Like for any work to be done beautifully, whether it is carpentry, whether it is farming, whatever it is, you need some kind of a creativity to do it beautifully, to be better than the others. You have to definitely be creative. So here he respects that creativity that his ancestors had, and he says that just like writing needs creativity, farming too needs creativity. That is also a kind of creative labor. So he compares, or he draws a similarity between the manual labor of the farmers and the creative labor of the poet. And because both of them, whether it is the poet or whether it is the farmer, both of them need dedication. They have to concentrate, they need skill, they need expertise. So he kind of blends them together. As he mentioned earlier about the roots, he is trying to connect the roots. What they did and what he did, he tries to bring them together. And here the writer has chosen a different vocation. He went over to get educated and to work in universities. So he chose the road not taken. The second reminds us of Robert Frost. Robert Frost, in The Road Not Taken, he expresses the dilemma that he faced. The dilemma that all of us face at some point in our lives, and especially in the case of Robert Frost, the problem was this: should I become a farmer or should I take up writing? Will poetry support me? Because farming almost assured some kind of a sustenance, a consistent kind of sustenance, but poetry was altogether new terrain, alien terrain. So should I go into that or should I stick here on safe grounds? But then he chose to become a poet. He left America for England, and there he made a career, then came back, and then he rose up to become one of the most respected poets of the United States. So there too, in that poem, he says that there were these two roads. One was trodden. Many people had followed that. That was the path towards becoming a farmer. Whereas the other one was less taken, less trodden. But then I decided to take the road not taken. So here too, Seamus Heaney too chose the road not taken. But then he's not unhappy about his choice. He's happy because he has achieved success there too, and his decision, it has not severed his roots, because he's still very close to his people and he still respects the roots and his traditions and customs. And as I mentioned earlier, though he moved away from County Derry, that movement was more geographical than psychological, because in his mind he was always connected to Ireland. So he is determined to do with his pen what his ancestors did with their spade. Okay, so they were always preparing the ground for something fresh, whether it's a new crop, something new, life-giving. So that is exactly what he tries to do with his pen. He tries to write something new, create something new out of his creativity, his imagination. Just like they cultivated potatoes and such crops, he cultivates poems, or he writes poems, he writes essays. And just as they continued the tradition of farming in keeping with the culture of Ireland, he too contributes to the culture of Ireland by writing about Ireland, by talking about the age-old traditions and customs of the land. In that way, he too contributes to his birthplace. So he is determined to do with his pen what his ancestors did with the spade, and he decides to dig with his pen. He decides to do what he loves the most. His ancestors loved to dig and to work in the fields. He loves to write, and so he decides to do what he loves to do. Only thing, the weapon or the tool has changed, but albeit the purpose remains the same. And so here you can see it's a very simple poem, but then you can see how he tries to contribute in his own way to his community and to the rich tradition of his land. And according to the critic called Morrison, a general spirit of reverence towards the past helped Heaney resolve some of his awkwardness about being a writer. He could serve his own community by preserving in literature its customs and crafts, yet simultaneously gain access to a larger community of letters. So that is what Seamus Heaney tried to do as a writer. He served his own community by preserving in literature the customs and crafts of his land, yet at the same time he tried to gain access to a larger community of letters. And that is why he also said that poetry can fortify your inner life and your inwardness. So poetry helped him to preserve the true self. The Irishman in him was always kept intact through his poetry. So this particular poem called Digging is often anthologized, as I mentioned, because it is most representative of Ireland and of this poet who refused to sever the roots with his homeland. It is most representative of a writer who was so much in love with his culture, with his country, and with his profession as a writer. In this poem you can see how well Seamus Heaney blends the past and the present, and how he blends the creativity in farming and the creativity in writing poetry, and how he reveres both of them. And that is something admirable about Heaney, and I guess this is exactly what must have made him popular with the common readers too, because we mentioned earlier that when he was given the Nobel Prize, the citation was that he has been awarded this for works of lyrical beauty and ethical depth, which exalt everyday miracles and the living past. And there is also this thing that he was able to establish something that most poets At least some poets, they are not able to, when they elevate themselves to great heights, when they become very, very intellectual, they lose this essential connection with their origins, whereas Heaney was able to maintain that till the end. So that is why, as Blake Morrison said, the author is that rare thing, a poet rated highly by critics and academics, yet popular with the common reader. So it is this rootedness, this groundedness, that definitely makes Seamus Heaney a popular writer with the common reader.